This is what I get for branching out. Spatial delivery. Ugh. So, this is apparently a part of a 2-book series, and the writer Gordon R. Dickson won an award for this book, which, okay, good for him. And the reviews of this thing are mostly positive on sites such as Goodreads. So, yeah, if you like this book, good for you. As for me, well, God, this thing was boring. Look, I thought Manhunt was dull. At least it told a story. At least I could grab onto that story. Okay, so in this novel, there's a former Olympian named John who has to go to Dilbia, a planet inhabited by space bears, to rescue a damsel in distress. That alone should tell you that it doesn't really take itself too seriously. Spatial delivery is definitely more of a comedy than a sci-fi, which would be fine if any of the comedy actually worked. Okay, look, not all books have to be a deep introspection into the human existence. They can be fun little romps for a quick read, but spatial delivery fails at everything it does. None of the jokes land. It's like watching a comedian fail at stand-up. The sci-fi elements are weak. There's barely any world building. Look, John is supposedly on this exotic planet with giant fucking bear creatures, and very little of it was fleshed out. The story felt like it was being told in a total void, almost. That's how little development there was. And of course, speaking of development, John and every character in this thing is so one-note, it's almost painful. So much so, like, the damsel that he ends up rescuing, he meets her twice before the end of the book, and she just, like, develops feelings for him. Just out of nowhere. So much so that at the end, when he faces the bad guy, the Terror, and he's, like, passed out, and she's crying over him, like, oh, I was so worried about you. It's like, you just met him. Her entire existence is, be the woman that gets caught. That's it for her. Most of spatial delivery is just boring conversation. There's a fight with the big baddie at the end, as I just mentioned, and John gets into some trouble with a few of the locals from time to time, but the beginning is him talking with the ambassador, and after he gets captured later on in the novel, he just sits around talking with his captors. Then there's this long drawn-out segment of this meeting between the Dilbians where they just bicker and argue with one another. Actually, I think that happens twice in the book. I'm sorry, I kind of blacked out trying to finish this thing, so don't mind me if my memory's a little sketchy. Whatever fun intention there is completely smoldered. And while I haven't seen it, from what I've heard, this is kind of like the Phantom Menace with how long and drawn out the political talks are. Guys, okay, first of all, this is not going to be a long review. I'm basically done at this point. But believe me when I say that this is the most boring thing I have ever read. It was painful to get through. At just 155 pages, it took me a week to trudge through it. I finished all of the Twilight novels this year. I finished all of them, and I did so in under 2 weeks. Over 1,000 pages of content in maybe 10 days. But this book took me a week to read. I had to read in 20-page chunks, and I'm not kidding you, there were times where I actually fell asleep reading it. I sat down to read it, and I closed my eyes for like a split second, and before I knew it, 2 hours had passed. And before someone tries to defend this thing and say, oh, you aren't supposed to take it seriously, it's just a light, funny sci-fi book, then why is it full of boring political talks and unfunny bullshit? I'm fine with shallow, fun distractions, but spatial delivery fails at even that. Ugh, okay, whatever. I'm just gonna give spatial delivery an F.